Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. This episode is brought to you by The Lost Debate. The Lost Debate is a podcast and YouTube show for political eclectics who want to escape their media bubbles and engage in good faith with ideas from across the political spectrum. The Lost Debate is hosted by three hosts: Ravi Gupta, a former staffer for Obama and school principal, who founded Arena, an organization that has trained thousands of campaign staffers and helped elect hundreds of candidates. He worked for the Obama campaign. Corey Bradford, a political organizer from the Deep South turned TikTok star, who once hosted a Fox News radio show. So, Corey's politics are going to be different than Ravi's. And Ricky Schlott, a Gen Z New York Post columnist and libertarian fighting to protect free speech. So these three cover the latest news, ideas, and trends in mainstream that mainstream media overlooks, and they do deep dives into important subjects of which they disagree with each other and actually have rational conversations. Now, interestingly, my guest today is this founder of Lost Debate, Ravi Gupta, and it's a super interesting conversation that deals with what it's like for him to grow up with a Democratic mother and a Republican father. And by the way, now he has a Trump-following father and a kind of a mainstream Republican brother, and then he's a Democrat. So that makes for some interesting conversations. In this conversation, we also discuss why Republicans supported and still support Trump. So his father is a stand-in for what appears to be tens of millions of Republicans who still think the 2020 election was rigged and that Trump should have been president, Biden is illegitimate, 2024, Trump's coming back, and so forth. So we get into all that, the rigged election conspiracy theory, QAnon, and so forth. We do a little dive into what's in store for 2022 and 2024, the rise of polarized politics in conjunction with political talk radio, political talk TV, and now social media. I asked him what it was like working on the Obama campaign from the inside, and why political parties do not have the power to select candidates that we think that they do. In other words, Republicans just can't say, well, we're not going to allow Trump to do this again. You could do it. Ravi also worked with an organization that helped freed felons regain their right to vote after they served their time. So we talk about why that should be. Of course, it should be that way, and why people think that they shouldn't. Since he ran a charter school, we talk about private schools, zip code public schools. That is to say, you have to go to the school in the zip code of where you live. Charter schools and the massive education inequality that we have now. We get into censorship and talking about Joe Rogan and Whoopi Goldberg and other examples of this. The moralization motivation behind cancel culture. In other words, cancel culture is not just we disagree with you. We want to ruin you, destroy you, end your career, get you fired, ruin your personal life. What in the world is behind that? And then we wrap up talking about critical race theory and race relations in America. Again, Ravi Gupta is the founder and CEO of this new media company, Lost Debate, that launched last October 2021 to fight polarization and misinformation online. The company has a seed funding of over $7 million, much of which came from Netflix founder Reed Hastings. So that's a good start. Before Lost Debate, Ravi founded Arena, where he led a team that helped elect over 100 candidates and launched the largest campaign staffer training academy in the history of the Democratic Party. And he's co-founder and chair of Second Chance Studios, a media company that exclusively employs the formerly incarcerated, and served as the co-host of Majority of 54, a political podcast about talking to friends and family with different political beliefs. Anyway, and then he worked, as I mentioned, on the Obama campaign. So I really get into asking him what it's like to be on the inside of something like that. Anyway, fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Here's Ravi Gupta. You have an incredible biography. I mean, it's just the number of things you've done of connecting with the CEO of Netflix and starting all these companies and working for the Obama administration. Oh my God, this just goes on and on. It's amazing. So give us a little bit of background on how you sound like Forrest Gump. You kind of stumble along into these amazing opportunities.
Yeah, it's funny. I use that metaphor a lot. It's like I'm kind of like the Forrest Gump of American politics these days. But my background is I grew up in Staten Island, New York, to a family that was split politically. My dad is a Republican, my mom is a Democrat, and my dad's an immigrant. He's from India. My mom is kind of like from a working class white Polish family in Staten Island. So I kind of have this eclectic ethnic background and grew up there. And Staten Island itself is very unique as a place. Like I essentially grew up on top of the largest garbage dump in the world, Fresh Kills landfill, essentially where for 50 years New York City was sending its trash. And so we kind of came up with this sort of populism that was innate to who we are because people were literally sending their trash into our backyard. So we sort of had this us against the world mentality. But then I got in a lot of trouble as a kid, but then I went off to the State University of New York and kind of turned my life around and then went on to law school at Yale. And that was basically from then on, I've been working in politics. I worked in Obama's campaign when he first ran for president. And then I worked at the United Nations when we won. And then, and we can get into this at some point, had like a big turn where I decided to go down south and start a bunch of charter schools. And I did that for 6 years. And then when Trump won, I was motivated to get back into politics and help support Democrats around the country. And I did that for 4 years. But I always knew that electoral politics for me, because I have kind of an independent streak and a set of beliefs that don't fit neatly into one party or the other, I always knew that my time was limited in electoral politics. So after we beat Trump, I stepped back out and have been launching this media company, The Lost Debate, the first show of which is the show you talked about, which is called The Lost Debate Show. And our whole mission is just to build a conversation between people who have different political beliefs and give people who are what we call political eclectics a place to go. People who may have loyalties at the ballot box, but who like to engage with views that are different than theirs.
Interesting. Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. So the fact that you grew up in a home divided by politics, do you think that shaped how you think about these things? Because you were exposed to arguments on both sides, and at some level this got inculcated into your brain, like it's not just one-sided. There's actually two different arguments here.
100%. In a way, that's probably the genesis of the name of our company and show, The Lost Debate, was that when I was a kid, my parents would debate, and they're both medical professionals, so there's no reason why they were that interested in politics. And it's taken me some time to figure out why they were so obsessed with politics and history, but they would just debate nonstop about everything. Like I remember my parents, one of the most intense arguments I remember them having when I was a kid was about who started the Vietnam War. Was it Eisenhower for sending advisors? Was it JFK? Was it LBJ? And, they would have knockout, drag-out fights, like not actual physical fights, but arguments about those things. And I always was exhilarated by that. And then, and they didn't stay married for too long, but that sort of culture then became part of my brother and sister and I, whereas my brother is a Trump-supporting Republican and I'm a Democrat. My sister's kind of an independent. We would argue about everything growing up. I used to study to go home from college so that like for Thanksgiving, like when the Iraq War was happening, for instance, when I was in college, I used to study and read up so that I could beat my brother in arguments about the war or whether it was George W. Bush's presidency, et cetera. And so it's always been central to who we are. I would say that over the past few years, the debates have become less fun. They feel more existential. I feel like people are listening to each other way less. People are less, like, I think, even tolerant of viewpoints that are different than theirs. And so that's in part why we're building this company, is that we want to build a culture where people are able to face belief systems and people that are very different than them, because we feel like that's central to this country. And it's also fun to debate issues. So, we're trying to build a culture where that is central to who we are.
Yeah, I like the idea of the solution to our divisiveness, and particularly driven by social media, is not break up the social media companies and regulate them and try to control what they're doing, but just have counters to that. People like you that just, I'm going to start a company that offers debates. Okay, good. Because that can happen like next week, as opposed to, legislating. It would probably take to break up to break up like Facebook or Twitter or something would take probably 10 years of lawsuits. With the government and these companies have, teams of lawyers that would fight that, and nothing would happen. And I like what you're doing about that. Okay, So you mentioned your brother. So what would you say are his best arguments for supporting Trump?
I think my brother is different than my dad. And so actually my experience with my dad and brother has helped me understand the texture of Trump's supporters. My dad is a Trump fan to the point where he has admitted to me that, when Trump said, if I shot somebody in the middle of 8th Avenue, my supporters would still be with me. I asked my dad point blank if that is my dad. And my dad was like, yeah, I'd still support him. And then I asked my dad, if that person he shot was me, would you still support him? And he essentially said yes. And so that's my dad. My dad is a cult follower of Trump. Yeah. And my dad, it goes, he has some out there views about why he believes in Trump. My brother, on the other hand, will admit the flaws of the man, but basically will say he's a flawed vessel for, calling out the nonsense that my brother believes exists on the left. So my brother is obsessed with things like cancel culture and immigration, and is, my brother, who like me is half Indian, feels like the question of race has become reductive, where essentially we want people to apologize for who they are if they're white. And also my brother believes that Asian Americans are discriminated against, but that the left doesn't care about that. And so, when he's on that lane, in many ways, I don't agree with everything my brother says, but I do think that there are problems on the left that, although my brother will at times exaggerate them, and he'll certainly not acknowledge, I think, where are many of the problems on the right, there's some truth to some of the things my brother says. So, for instance, like the fact that Asian Americans are discriminated against, like the Harvard affirmative action case, for example, is true in my opinion. I think that like Asian Americans are discriminated against in certain aspects, and especially in that Harvard case. I think it's indisputable, and so I, in many ways, spend a lot of time trying to push people on the left to not have a double standard when it comes to this kind of stuff, and see it. And I think that's true of debates around cancel culture, for example, where my brother will probably say that, cancel culture is a problem, period. Whereas I would say, all right, like this is the excess of an important conversation. Like there's an important conversation where we need to hold people like Harvey Weinstein accountable, but there are certain downstream consequences of the conversation we have that's less healthy, where people are shutting down people who have viewpoints that are different than theirs, or having a sort of mob mentality and having fun teaming up on people and destroying their lives. And I would say that's a problem, but I would draw the line somewhere different than my brother, I would say.
Yeah. So for your brother, he recognizes the flaws in Trump. It's a hold your nose, pull the handle, because I can't vote Democrat.
Yes.
Hillary or Biden are terrible candidates. Trump is awful, but he's better than them. But for your dad, as sort of a cult follower, I don't really get this the kind of cult a personality of Trump. Is it just that because he's a strong character that's going to own the libtards and squash the crazy left, or is there something more?
That's more my brother. Yeah, my brother is more motivated by that stuff. Like my brother is like obsessed with AOC and identity politics, and he thinks that he's kind of obsessed with democratic corruption and obsession on immutable characteristics and things like that. So I think it's kind of an interesting conversation, me and my brother. My dad is the kind of person that if he were in the right circumstance would be a devoted Scientologist, for example. He's the kind of person who needed somebody to come along and tell him a story. And he happened to be in the right place at the right time, where the story he was being sold was the Republican Party. And as the party evolved, my dad went from a Reaganite. When he first moved to the United States, my dad had the juxtaposition of Carter and Reagan. And essentially, my dad was like, all right, Carter's weak. Reagan's the movie star, strong figure. And my dad became a Republican. And then he got radicalized by right-wing radio and then Fox News, and now sort of fringe elements on the internet. And Lord knows, I don't even know what he's listening to anymore. But he's become more conspiratorial. And what's tragic to me is that he doesn't think of himself as an American. He thinks of himself as a member of the Republican Party. And I've watched this happen to him. And to me, that's the conversation I have with him all the time, is where I constantly try to push him to think about this country and its institutions, one of those institutions being our family. and why his loyalty should be wider than to this one party, but it's not easy. And I would say the Republican Party is winning. Or maybe has already won over his heart and mind. Whereas my brother is like a veteran. He's a federal corrections officer. He's the kind of person who he has a loyalty to country that my dad doesn't have. I would say he doesn't view the threat of the Republican Party the way I do, but I would say he's probably more persuadable.
Yeah. Let's let your brother and father be a stand-in for what a lot of people represent, because no one listening is going to know who they are. I don't even know who they are.
Yeah.
But we know from recent polls that something like 70%, I think the poll last week, we're recording this on February 23rd, found that something like 70% of Republicans say they think the election was rigged. There was some, shenanigans going on there. Biden is not legitimate. 2024 is going to be the showdown. We're going to get our man back in power where he rightfully belongs, and therefore violence. Some percentage of that 70% said, the use of violence would be correct, and so that would represent probably maybe both your father and your brother, but a large cohort of that kind of right-leaning Republican/conservative. Seems like they're divided now. There's kind of principled conservatives, sort of like a Charles Krauthammer, George Will, old school Reagan type Republicans. I mean, Reagan he was a movie star, but he honed his arguments in that Westinghouse sponsored lecture series that he gave for years as a spokesman for them. But he was really, kind of echoing principles of conservatism of the 1950s and 60s, such that by the time he started running, he really knew what he was talking about. So he was he's not a cult leader in a cult of personality like Trump is. He actually had arguments.
Yeah.
I find it baffling why any Republican or conservative would think Trump is a Republican or conservative. He doesn't, I don't see the connection.
Yeah, the modern day Republican Party to me is more motivated by what they're against than what they're for. And I think Trump to them is their sort of knight in shining armor against the liberals. And the people like my brother are just so motivated against liberals that it almost doesn't matter that what Trump is for. And interestingly, my brother, at least the last time I checked in on this, wasn't a believer in the election conspiracy. So he's probably in the minority on that. My dad is a believer in those conspiracies. And the way I talk to independents, especially, or persuadable Republicans, is like what I say to them is, if I agreed with the Republican Party on 99 out of 100 issues, that happens to not be true. But if I agree with them on 99 out of 100 issues, but the one issue to me is the integrity of this democracy, I would still pull the lever for a Democrat right now. And it's not 99 in one, but the reason why is obvious, because this whole thing only works if we're able to engage with each other through our democracy. And so that is a non-negotiable for me. And part of where I've had some success persuading certain friends of mine, whether it's on Staten Island or down in Tennessee or whatever, of at least being more skeptical of the Republican Party, is when I start the conversation that way. And then I say, look, here are the issues where I disagree with the Democrats on. A lot of education issues I disagree with them on. I don't trust government the way that Democrats do to deliver for people. So I'm way more libertarian than a lot of people are. I certainly am like you. I'm skeptical of breaking up big tech, or I don't always look to the government to solve all of our problems and stuff like that. So I'll talk like that. And I feel like people will be like, all right, I kind of trust you more because you're willing to criticize this party even as you pull a lever for them. And that's a little bit about what we do at Lost Debate, is not only are we willing to criticize Democrats, we spend as much time criticizing Biden as anybody because he's the leader right now. And we view that the buck stops with whoever the leader is. It's almost inconceivable that I wouldn't vote for him unless there was a strong third-party candidate. But that doesn't mean he's off limits for us. Like, we feel like it's really important to build that trust with our audience.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, again, we're going to face this first we have the midterm, so we'll see how that goes. You think the Republicans will take back the seats of power there? And therefore 2024 is going to...
Yeah, I think that they have an advantage for sure. Now, their advantage is not as strong as otherwise would be because Democrats maximize their hand with redistricting. So I always thought we were like Democrats were going to be the losers in the redistricting process, but Republicans strangely got their strategy wrong around the country, in part because I think there's, for all the strengths of the right wing machine, they're kind of a little bit disorganized because of the virulence of Trump and how it's like caused a little bit of chaos in state parties. And essentially what the Republicans did was they maximized their incumbent protection at the expense of going on the offensive to gain new seats, while as Democrats sacrificed more incumbents in order to gain the possibility to gain more seats. And we were ruthless in certain states like New York that really mattered. So in a way, we're at least there's a lot that could still happen, but Democrats came out a little bit better in redistricting than expected. The other element that makes me hopeful is that the dynamics of these primaries, which are playing out over the next few months for the Republican Party, are insane. Like it is a competition to see who could kiss Trump's feet the quickest and grovel in the most extreme ways. Like a good example is Ohio, where J.D. Vance, who had been previously this thoughtful, nuanced guy, is like, playing the part of a Marjorie Taylor Greene-esque Republican. And the more that happens, the more Democrats have an opportunity. Now, Biden's deeply unpopular. There seems to be one crisis after another that he has to deal with. And if I'm being honest, he could do better. And I spent a lot of time talking about that. And so we have issues, and, generally parties lose seats anyway in the midterm. So we have an uphill climb. But if Republicans continue to do insane things in their primaries, and if Democrats field good candidates, we have a shot, and a shot is all we can hope for. And then we just have to maximize our advantage. And, that's all we can hope for. And so I'm cautiously optimistic, and I'm monitoring these Republican primaries closely because they are going to deliver flawed candidates, to say the least.
Yeah, what is the psychology of someone like a Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio who, Trump famously just defamed in the primaries? I mean, Lion Ted and Little Marco, and he called Cruz's wife ugly, and I don't know, his dad was involved in the JFK assassination. I mean, how is it these guys listen to this? They have to be just incensed at the stuff he was saying. And then 6 months later, it's like, oh yeah, he's our man. We love him. He's great. And no one asks them, like, well, what about that thing you said about your wife? Doesn't that bother you?
Yes.
Why are you supporting this guy? So, I mean, it's probably just a Machiavellian power thing, and you just keep your mouth shut
I think it,
press on.
I think it depends on the person. I think of it for some of those guys, it's the equivalent of like how people gain weight. It's like nobody is like, I'm going to eat a 1 million calorie meal. It's like, it's just a series of choices that bring you down a certain path. And I think for them, it's like, all right, I'm going to do the one phone bank for Trump. I'm going to issue a lukewarm endorsement. All right, then the next time I got to give a bigger endorsement because my incentives line up this way. And then at a certain point, you're turning around and you don't believe Biden won the election, and you've forgotten what even got you into this, assuming there even was anything that got you into it in the first place. And with those two guys in particular, they were there's no politician, especially anybody who runs for president, who doesn't do it because they have a huge ego. But the better politicians have at least some percentage of them that believes in something outside of themselves, and they're able to marry that with their ego. Now, those two guys, in my opinion, had a particularly strong percentage of their quotient that was straight ego. And so for them, it's pretty easy to just change their position, whereas I think there are others who, I think Romney being an example, somebody who I've been critical of at various points, I think has a stronger moral foundation than a lot of these people. I think because of his father, a lot of people can be explained as I'm sure you're more aware than anybody, by their parents. And I think Romney grew up with a father who took a stand and paid the electoral price for that. So his ethical system, I think, tells him that's like he looks himself in the mirror and sees somebody in his father's image who does that kind of thing. Now, do I wish he did it more? Yes. But he seems a little bit more resistant to that sort of treadmill than some of these other people are. But, I would never bet on anybody in that party doing the right thing when faced with consequences otherwise. Romney also has the advantage of coming from Utah, which has I think a more independent streak. Their governor is pretty good, all things considered. Spencer, I forget his last name, but I've interviewed him before. The Republican governor of of Utah is pretty independent and pretty sensible.
Yeah, well, Liz Cheney's been hammered for standing up to Trump. So the question is how many Liz Cheneys would it take to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do this ever again? And for the rest to cascade into line and go, yeah, that's right. We of course, we don't want Trump. And then he's just out by volume of enough protesters against him.
Yeah. Well, I think in a year or two, we're going to look back on the Liz Cheneys and the Adam Kinzingers of the world like we look at brontosauruses. Like they're just not, they're going to be extinct. There's just, the party doesn't allow for it. Now, I commend them for it. And it's possible one or two of them wins. You know, I would say that Murkowski is a good example of somebody who's going to survive because Alaska is unique. It's kind of like Utah in that way. And, you know, she had the distinction of losing a primary previously and then winning a write-in campaign, which means she's almost politically invincible. And so it's possible that one or two of these, I mean, Kinzingers are going to be already gone. You know, Cheney could survive, but there's just so few of them that they almost need to start a new party. I'm a big believer that we need more parties. I know it's risky. I know that the calculus is very hard, but, you know, I was just recently reading about Ross Perot. I was a kid when Perot ran, and, you know, he didn't get a single electoral vote, but, you know, I had to remind myself that there were points where he was leading in the polls. And I often think about how different the world would be if he had won that election, you know? Even though I kind of see myself as a Democrat, I think whether he's my kind of independent or not, I think the idea that somebody could win as an independent, I think would open up so much more within our politics. But nobody wants to do it because the math is such that in any given presidential cycle, you basically hand over the ability to pick the president to a majority of not the House of Representatives, as you know, but like the majority of states within the House of Representatives, which means that you're guaranteeing the Republican Party can pick the president essentially, unless you are a juggernaut as an independent. Like you have to win over 50%. You can't just win the plurality. And so that's what's tricky. And that's why I think a lot of people are always nervous when even good candidates say they're going to run as independents.
Yeah, let's take these two issues of gerrymandering and voter ID that are on the table now. What's wrong with the Republican argument that, hey, you got to have an ID to drive a car and, you know, all these other things in life, and you have to have a passport if you want to travel and so on and so on. At the very least, you should have an ID to vote. What's wrong with that argument?
You know, there's a part of me that thinks, all right, if we just had voter ID, national voter ID, everybody got an ID, that would actually probably be a good system. Now, there are all sorts of issues that have to be worked through, but like the idea of a national ID makes some sense to me. And if that's what this was really about like truly like streamlining the system, fine. Now I would want it. I don't trust the motives. And I also don't trust some of the double standards. Like you can't use your student ID in some places, but you could use a gun license. These are all things that are very transparent in terms of their political motivations. So, and then like, this is the same party that's, you know, decreasing resources for urban voting sites that lead to long lines, purging voter rolls, you know, like what's going on in Florida is a great example. Like my good friend Desmond Meade had fought really hard for former felons convicted felons of getting their franchise back. And the voters support it in a referendum and Republicans have been blocking it. Like, so this is, to me, it's like, if it were just a good faith argument over what's the best way to create a system with the highest amount of integrity, and maybe we could solve a bunch of problems with the national ID or whatever, fine. But that's not what this is about. This is about throwing up as many obstacles as possible to people that are different from you. And it's the same party that doesn't believe the last election was even decided fairly, and in some places like Wisconsin are trying to decertify it. So like it's hard to take the whole package deal, you know, like if I could just isolate it and say, all right, like objectively speaking, are the words you're saying like valid or at least respectable? Sometimes I could pick and choose things here and there and say, all right, like I could see where you're coming from, but when I take it as a total story being told, I am very skeptical.
And then with gerrymandering, Republicans would say, well, you guys do this, you Dems, you do the same thing. This is how the game is played. We win some, we lose some. And so, buck up and play the game.
The difference, though, is that we want to pass national legislation to make it nonpartisan. And we also want Supreme Court justices who overturn these maps, whether they're Democratic or Republican. Like, we're on record for that. And if they didn't block our voting rights bills, we would have it. Now, like, there's I don't believe that Democrats should unilaterally disarm. It pisses me off that swing districts will no longer exist. And I'm seeing this in two places that I've spent most of my life. Staten Island, New York, has been the swing district that's changed hand multiple times in my adult lifetime. And it's going to become largely a very heavily Democratic district now in these new redistricting. And then on the opposite side, Nashville had a congressional district that gave us Jim Cooper, who I feel like is a really good member of Congress. And now with the new maps, Nashville is going to be sliced up. And in all likelihood, Nashville will not have a member of Congress from Nashville. It'll probably be like a series of representatives from outlying areas that happens to cut into Nashville. And so I think the idea that Nashville doesn't deserve its own member of Congress is crazy. It's a growing, amazing southern city that has so much going for it. It should have its own member of Congress, right? So I believe that we need to fix redistricting. I don't love the fact that any party, including Democrats, are choosing the voters and not the other way around. But I also don't think unilaterally disarming is the right way to go. And when the Republicans, shed their crocodile tears, I don't lose a minute of sleep over it. Like my sense is we should make them feel the pain as much as possible so that they come to the table. Like if they now believe that they're losing the redistricting game and then they came to the table now and said, well, in the next election, or the next census or whatever, let's have redistricting reform. I would be for that. Let's just do it now. They happen to lose this round potentially, and hopefully that brings them to the table. I don't think they will, because I think they're good at learning. So I think they're going to learn. They'll fall in line 10 years from now, and they'll probably do better than they did this time around in redistricting. And there's a lot of reason to believe that the census is going to be in their favor, because at least if the first few years of this decade are a guide, red states are gaining population. And so the only way that Democrats, I think, gain from that process is if we tip some red states, right? Let's say Idaho, Montana, Texas, some of these states, North Carolina, where people are moving to tip into the blue category, then they're in trouble. I mean, Texas being a particularly salient example of that. But they have such a stranglehold over state legislatures that it's going to be a battle. I mean, even if we have a majority of Democrats in a state like North Carolina, or Texas, unless the judges intervene, Republicans they're gonna maximize their hand. Although from a presidential perspective, it could get interesting because you can't redistrict out of that.
Yeah, I guess the argument from the Democrat side is that, say, for example, requiring voter ID, well, it costs money to get a passport or a driver's license, and it takes time, and poor people just don't have the time or money to do this. They're working two jobs, so on. They're just lucky to get through the day, and they're more likely to vote Democrat. So the ploy is, if we require them to jump through enough hoops, they'll just say, fuck it, I'm not going to vote. And then that's a vote for a Republican if they were going to vote Democrat. That's the argument, right? Is that true?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Trump has a sizable base of low-income voters too. And I think I haven't looked closely to see what studies would say about their behavior. If you put more hoops for them versus low income Democrats, who wins out. I suspect Democrats would be hurt more. But we have become this party of higher income people in this country, which is why in some ways we buck the trend at times. It used to be that we suffer the most in off-year elections. And I think as this realignment, and in part because we had been the party of the low income, and the Republicans had the sort of country club Republicans, the suburban Republicans and all that. But as we've succeeded in making incursions into the suburbs, there's certainly exceptions like the most recent Virginia election. But as we succeeded in making incursions to the suburbs, there's certain races, Georgia being an example, where we actually benefit from a race that tilts in favor of high information voters. right? What you saw in Georgia was actually a lot of the low-income Trump voters, in part because of his own like propaganda about the election being stolen, stayed home. And a lot of higher information suburban Democratic voters came to the polls. And you had enough low-income communities of color for Democrats to show up as well, that it became the perfect storm. Now, I don't think that's perfectly replicable, but at least means that things could get interesting from here on out. And a lot of our assumptions about the nature of Democratic versus Republican voters could change as Trump continues to build his low-income rural vote, rural and exurban vote base. So it could come back to haunt them in some ways if they put too many obstacles up to vote, because that's Trump's base is becoming more so-called blue collar.
Yes, and since you run an organization that helps felons get their voting rights back, is it the belief that felons are more likely to be Democrats when they get out? They're going to vote Democrat. Is that even true, or is that just an urban legend that Republicans have glommed onto?
I mean, given the fact that we, disproportionately incarcerate people of color in this country, so they're more likely to go to prison, I'm sure that, if I'm being honest, I'm sure that helps. That's not why I work with former felons. So one nonprofit I started helps former felons get jobs. It has nothing to do with voting. So this is something I care about one way or the other, and so, to me, my basic philosophy on that, and I happen to be aligned with the Koch network on this because they believe this. Now, I think they could be putting more skin in the game on this, but we happen to be aligned in the belief that when you do your time and you come out, you should be afforded the rights of any other citizen. And that's part of what it means to rehabilitate somebody. That's my belief, is either keep people in prison for the rest of their lives or truly allow them to transition into society. And it seems strange to me that we draw the line at voting, as the thing that we don't allow. It's actually the thing we should be encouraging people to do, to get involved with their community. It's a part of what it means to re-enter society. And there's actually a symmetry to that in the way I think about this question of cancel culture, right? When I talk to members on the left, I'll say I'm consistent on this, which means that if somebody committed murder and they've served their time and they come out, I will work with them and help them get a job. Whereas a lot of my friends on the left, if somebody says the wrong words, they feel like they should be unemployable for the rest of their life. I just think that people deserve second chances when they've gone through a process that to me demonstrates that they have changed, because I do believe in the capacity to change. Now, I do think that depending on your offense, that time needs to be longer, and that there are certain offenses for which there is not a sufficient amount of time to convince me that you would be somebody we should trust in polite society. But those are usually rare circumstances. We don't put people away for the rest of their lives that often for a reason, because there's both a societal cost to it, and we generally believe in some sense of proportionality.
Yeah, a lot of my friends, including myself, have asked, why can't the Republican Party just say, we're not going to do Trump again, and we have that kind of control? Since you worked on the Obama administration, well, you worked on the Obama campaign, so you're an insider. I just don't know how the system really works. Is it the case that the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, they can't control who's going to win the primaries, and they can't, select who the candidate's going to be? There really is kind of an open-endedness to it.
Yeah, there's this sense, I think, because people watch a lot of TV, that there's these puppet masters behind the scenes who pick the next presidential nominee.
Cigarette smoking men in the back room.
That has never been true. There were groups who had more influence back in the day, right? But by and large, a lot of these candidates, if you think about our lifetime, Obama was anti-establishment. This sort of establishment had blessed Hillary. I know, because I was a fundraiser for Obama. I know how many doors were shut to us. If you think about the fact that McCain became the nominee eventually of the Republican Party. He was an anti-establishment Republican. You had Bill Clinton. I mean, these are not your establishment candidates. Now, back in the day, there were certain centers of power that had more influence, but even then, they were always surprised. Jimmy Carter wouldn't have existed if the sort of, the villains in the room petting their cats were picking, the candidates. So it's always been true that there are powerful people who have influence. I would say those people have less influence than they've ever had before on either party. And in part, that's because of the disaggregated way that people can raise money. It's in part because of the disaggregation of media. Like, it's not like that one interview on the network news is going to make the difference anymore. Like, people can go out and communicate with people in their own ways. I think there's a lot of good things about that, but I think there's also an excess to that gives us people like Trump. And so, it's part of the reason why I'm starting to work in media, is because I think media is it matters more than ever, and that the relative lack of cost to starting a media company means that there are democratizing aspects to that, but there are also hugely problematic and dangerous currents to that we just need to battle. Like, we need to go out there and find the misinformation. We need to find the people who are in bad faith. We need to expose it. We need to be diligent about it, and then we need to hold those standards to ourselves and say, you know what, we're going to fact check when we get something wrong. We're going to admit it, and we're going to try to be as objective as we can, knowing that pure objectivity is impossible.
Yeah. So you're a media company. So let's talk about social media and what the problem is that needs to be solved and what you're doing about that. So you accessed somehow the president or CEO of Netflix, I guess, and Netflix and Amazon are the two largest film production companies and movie studios and television networks in the world now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they just have this endless content, so they have power. Is it your sense that you're pushing up against Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and all this stuff and conservative talk radio and Fox News and OAN and all this stuff? Is this the idea? You're countering this with just more voices and more power behind those voices?
Yeah, I think in the way we think of it is we like to go to the dark corners of the internet to engage with people. So instead of saying, all right, we're afraid of it, we're just confronting it. And that means that, we're going to court sometimes opposition when we, for instance, when we debunk something. Like, a good example is all this conversation around Rogan, right? Now, I'm not this person who thinks Rogan is an evil guy, but I'm also not somebody who views Rogan as some kind of deity, right? And I think what's interesting to me is that as I have seen the media environment respond to something like Rogan, people have largely fit into those two camps, where it's either they view their job as to take down Rogan, as if that's even possible, and then there's these group of people who are almost Rogan apologists, because either they go on his show or they view him as some kind of figure who's ideologically aligned or whatever. And my sense is, I respect Rogan. I understand his appeal. A lot of people I grew up with like to listen to him. I think he comes at it honestly. I think he tries to figure things out. I think I have certain critiques of the way he goes about that, and I'm not afraid to share them. And because of that, I catch heat from liberals who feel like I'm not hard enough on him, and then his apologists who feel like I'm somehow attacking him. And that's generally how we go about our business, is we just try to tell the truth. We try not to have anybody who, we try not to be beholden to an ideology or a clique or whatever, and just try to tell it like it is. And as part of that, we like to engage on those platforms you talked about. We don't spend a lot of time saying, is this platform good or bad? And more are people using it? And if they're using it to find their information, we need to be on it telling a story. And that means that we're on TikTok, we're on YouTube, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're in podcasts. And so we're putting information out there to engage with as many people as possible. And there's different audiences. So TikTok, ton of young people, obviously. And so the kind of people and the kind of comments we'll get on our TikTok page are way different than the stuff that we get on YouTube, which skews older and more conservative. And so, but it's great. Honestly, I love it. I love seeing where people are. And what I'm finding is that there is a quiet majority of people out there who are not radical and who are just fed up. And those are the people who can be radicalized if you don't give them a place to go, which is why your show is really important, and other shows like that, is to say, all right, we need to come to the table and be reasonable and try to figure things out in good faith, and not have a team that you feel the need to constantly defend.
I never imagined I'd hear the lines that Facebook trends toward older and conservatives. Like, what? How did that happen? Yeah. There is this, I forget whose law it is, that, if organizations are not avowedly liberal, they inevitably shift rightward as they get older. I don't know if it's the older people running it or whatever, but so that's interesting to try to, access all those different platforms. And you have three hosts yourself, a Democrat, one of the hosts is a Republican, the other one's, I guess, more libertarian. So how do you, behind the scenes, before you start in on a debate, do you sort of outline what it is, who's going to say what, or you just do it free flow as it kind of happens in a natural conversation?
We just pick stories. Like every morning we have a member of our team who monitors conservative media, a member of our team who monitors progressive media, and then somebody who monitors everything else. And we have certain go-to news sources, and we pitch stories. Like, do we want to talk about this new mask mandate? Do we want to talk about this critical race theory debate? Do we want to talk about, like the school shooting or whatever? And we have like a certain sense of what a good story is for us. And generally that means either something that the media isn't covering enough, but we think it's really important, or we think that the media is covering wrong. Or a third option is there a significant disagreement amongst our team such that the conversation would be interesting? And we call it the lost debate, but we don't want to be crossfire. So we don't have like a sense that we need to contrive a debate. So a lot of times we'll get up and we'll actually agree with each other on something. We'll have the same perspective, but just we'll come at it differently. So Ricky, my co-host, is like a libertarian conservative who may be like, she has a different sense of the critical race theory debate than, say, I do as a former school principal, right? Or that my co-host Corey, who grew up as an African American in the Deep South, we may even come out with similar places on something, but we'll have a very different perspective on it. But then there'll be other things like vaccine mandates, for example, where I'll be just, I'm generally pro-vaccine mandate, although I've weakened in that position over time, and Rick, in part because of these debates. And then Ricky was she's very anti-vaccine mandate. And so we'll argue the philosophy behind it, the science behind it, the effectiveness of it. And so that would be more of like a straight up, we have very different perspectives.
Yeah, interesting. So let's go through some of those. Let me make just a comment on Joe Rogan, because maybe I'm one of those guys, since I was on his show 6 times and I know Joe pretty well, that I defended him. But I think if you're thinking of Joe Rogan as a journalist who has fact checked the stories and he's presenting an episode in which he's going to have a bullet list, like Mike Wallace is going to ask these 12 tough questions of the guest on the other side of the table. That's not what he does. He just turns the mic on and starts talking. I've been on, every time I'm on, it's usually one of my books or something. He hasn't read the book. He's like, what's your book about? It's the first time I've seen it. Oh, okay. So, and then I'm just telling him what my book is about. That's kind of how it works. And he probably doesn't even know what he's going to say till it comes out. It's like, I wonder what he's going to say today. Oh, there it is. Okay. I have noticed, I listened to a couple of episodes since the big flap a couple of weeks ago. And I noticed he's pushing back a little harder. He just had Majid Nawaz on, who was criticizing the vaccine and mask mandates in the UK, and Joe was pushing back a little bit harder than he normally does. I thought, okay, that's interesting. So maybe we can nudge these people. Yeah,
I noticed that too, and I think what you said is where I come out on this. And I got a lot of heat for saying this to a left-leaning audience recently. I said, I believe, and maybe this is like a central tenet of who I am, in the capacity of people to change. And to me, all I want is for Rogan to grow. And that doesn't make him exceptional. I want myself to grow. If I'm the same person 10 years from now that I am today, I failed, right? And so that's where I looked at Rogan, and I saw this where his interview with Jordan Peterson, for example, like he interviewed Peterson, and Peterson was making certain claims about climate change that I thought were worthy of challenge, and Rogan pushed him pretty aggressively.
He did,
and that was right in the middle of the vaccine stuff. And I pointed to that to left-leaning audiences to say, what do you want from Rogan? Do you want him to just crawl under a rock? That ain't going to happen, right? Like, what you want from him is what you should want of yourself, which is you take feedback, you get better. That's it. That's all you ask. And to me, Rogan and why I'm probably a somewhat admirer of him is that he is very transparently trying to be better, in my opinion. That's where I come out. He doesn't invite me on his show. I don't have a relationship with him. I don't owe him anything. But I do see him as somebody who takes seriously his personal growth. And that to me means he's like one of the good guys.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this kind of broader problem, this kind of moralization sense behind cancel culture. It's not enough to correct somebody like, oh, Rogan, you should have done this about climate change or that about vaccines, or Whoopi Goldberg, you got it wrong about the Holocaust. It was about race, when in fact Whoopi was just simply echoing the current modern progressive idea, defining race as just skin color. That's it. It's only skin color. Of course, that's not what the Nazis thought of the concept of race, nor did anybody else before a few years ago. So you can hardly blame Whoopi for simply restating what critical race theory's kind of been pushing. But nevertheless, that didn't seem to be enough. It's like, no, Rogan's got to be canceled. Whoopi Goldberg, you have to take 2 weeks off and go stand in the corner with your dunce cap on.
Yeah.
And you were a bad girl.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
It's like, what?
It's ridiculous.
Why is it not enough, that people want, they want people's jobs to be lost. You must be fired. We want your personal life ruined, right? And I was just reading a study about this. Some social psychologist did a study on this, starting with the Ashley Madison site. You remember Ashley Madison site? Life is short, have an affair.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
This was the
so somebody hacked it.
Site, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if he was behind it, but it was just this site for married people to hook up. Well, as it turns out, after this expose,
now I remember what you're saying. Yeah.
It was like 95% of the accounts were men, and most of the other 5% were not women; they were bots. So these guys were, having these hot conversations, arranging a hookup with a computer, and but it wasn't enough to expose that part of it. The person who hacked it posted all of the men's names on a website. So of course, I'm sure there were spouses and marriages that, were just, shattered by this. What are you doing on this site looking for a hookup? We're married. Okay. Why is it that people have to go and try to destroy other people's lives? What is your sense about that?
I think it's usually a reflection of something that's missing in the sort of the bully is usually incomplete in some way, right? And the person who joins that mob dynamic probably has something missing in their life. And so I try to remind myself of that, because it's the only way to not lose your mind over this kind of stuff, is to say, all right, I feel bad for people who this is the way they engage, because it makes the world so negative and tiring. The world is better when you're looking for reasons to believe in people and looking for reasons to see progress and help be a part of it, right? Like the Rogan example is a perfect example. The Whoopi example is a perfect example. It's like, do you want this person to feel pain? If you do, then why? Like really, what is it is that just like, is that your pain speaking, right? Like, why would you want somebody to feel pain, right? I would want them to change. And honestly, often, if I'm being honest, I don't care that much whether somebody changes who I don't know. Like, I don't know what people, Goldberg, I don't watch your show. Therefore, I shouldn't have that much to say about it. The people who care a lot about her show and really believe in her, maybe they should have something to say about it. But I think these people are like heat-seeking missiles for grievance. They're like, all right, I don't watch that. Like, these people don't even watch Rogan, and they have like all these opinions about Rogan. It's like, let his audience take care of it, right? Like, now, like, there is an exception to if he's motivating people to do things and that's encroaching on your life, then I think it's fair game, right? But like, if by and large, like, there are things being said or done on this platform that you don't really engage in, like, let other people figure out. There's so many things you could worry about in this world. Why is that the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning? And often, like, I think people should have, I have a friend of mine who has a rubber band that he keeps around his wrist. And every time he complains about something, or he even has a thought about complaining about something, he just snaps it. And I think like I would prescribe this to anybody, is like, I don't have the equivalent of that, but because of his suggestion, I have this rule now where if I'm either complaining about something or I'm like expressing even any kind of negativity, even to myself, I have to pair it with a positive. So because it's like, you have to discipline yourself to find, like, if you don't think that way, you have to discipline yourself to find reasons to say great things about people, to believe in people, to believe in the capacity of people to change, because I think that the incentive on media, the incentive in society is to gossip, it's to be negative, it's to gang up on people. And we've got to be forces, I think, balancing that out, or the world just becomes like a high school cafeteria where people are picking on each other all the time, you know?
Yeah. I think it does tap into human nature. We do have an impulse for revenge and to wrong right strongly, to signal to other people, not just the wrongdoer, but other, onlookers, this is bad and you better not do it. Like Joe Rogan can't be canceled, but in a way it's a signal like, those of you who could be canceled, you better look at what we're doing to this guy. All right. Now, maybe he escapes, but you might not escape, right? It's a little bit like that.
That's such an important point.
There's studies on this showing
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
That's
right.
A
delay.
So,
my apologies.
Yeah. No, it's okay. These studies showing that, like the ultimatum game where let's say I have $100 and I can offer you some percentage of it. And if you accept the offer, we split it. And if you reject the offer, neither of us gets any money. So the experimenter gives me $100 and I say, all right, Ravi, I'll give you $30. Now, will you take it? I'm going to get 70 and that doesn't seem right. But, maybe you're thinking, well, I get $30. So, hey, I didn't have $30 before this. Well, at some point, people reject the offer. If it's not, like 70, 30, 60, 40, people reject it. The explanation is that the utility payoff of that $30 or $40 is not worth this other guy getting something unfairly. That's an unfair offer. So we have this impulse that, I'm going to punish you. I'm willing to pay $30 to the experimenter by not taking it to punish you so you don't get anything, right? And I think this goes a long ways toward explaining this kind of political polarization now. It's that, the other side is not just incorrect in their policies about abortion or immigration. They're not just wrong. They're morally wrong. They're evil. They must be punished for holding these positions. And I think that really took off with conservative talk radio. I'm old enough to remember when this happened, when Rush Limbaugh came online, and there was buzz about his show, and some of my more right-leaning, case I was a bike racer in the 80s, some of my cycling buddies were like, you got to hear this guy. Oh my God, you can't believe the stuff he's saying on the air. So I listen, I'm like, holy crap, no one says stuff like this. And this was, the feminazis and all the terms he came up with. And then his ratings just went up and up and up. And it's like, that's astonishing. What is going on here? And in reflection, I think it is this, people listening thinking, yeah, those people, we're going to get them and destroy them because they're evil. And that's that kind of revenge impulse you have, to punish somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I saw that firsthand. My dad was listening to Rush Limbaugh, Graham, all these types of guys who were in the 90s. And, what I see, Rush Limbaugh is an instructive case. Like, this is the guy who his personal life and his public life to me mirrored each other. Like, this gets to the sense that broken people often are the ones who are the most mean-spirited. It's that, like, that lack of integrity and a lack of balance is going to spill out into other places. It's why, Bill O'Reilly, self-destructed. And to me, that's why I think anybody getting into this media space, my sense in my very short time just starting to be out there a little bit more is like, you have to have a moral code. Otherwise, you're going to lose yourself. Like, you have to know where your line is. You have to know when you have to make hard choices. Like, what does it mean for you to have a relationship with an audience and to treat them with a certain level of care and respect? And how do you take feedback? What we've started to do on our show is at the end of every show, whenever we get like a criticism from the audience, that's not just like straight up, like, all caps, like cursing or whatever. But if somebody has like a thoughtful critique, we try to end the show with it. And say, all right, this person pointed out this thing. And sometimes people will point out like that study we cited is wrong, or that, there's some, there's some new piece of information we didn't take into account or something. And it's usually really good. And that's what we're trying to build. And our theory is that people want more of that. People, there's no shortage of people, preaching to the choir, and saying, the least predictable thing possible. And I think that's a challenge in both political parties. I'm not a both sideser, but I do think that like there's problems with the media within both. I wouldn't make them equal, but they certainly exist. And, this is what makes me excited is I think there are a lot of reasonable people out there, and I think they're dying for, just somebody they can trust, and I think that's why you have such a large audience yourself.
The question I guess we all face here is trying to do that is how to make that entertaining. So my favorite example of this comes from Howard Stern's autobiographical film, Private Parts. And it's the scene where he's just become famous on NBC, just really exploded. And the Paul Giamatti character is just baffled how this complete crazy guy could be like their number one star. And the other executive he's talking to says, yeah, it's a good question. The average radio listener listens for 18 minutes. The average Howard Stern listener, like an hour and a half. How can that be? What's the reason they give? Because they want to see what he's going to say next. And he says, okay, how about the people that hate him? He says, good question. They listen to him twice as long as the people that like him. Why do they listen if they hate him?
Yeah.
They want to see what he's going to say next, right?
Yep.
So there's that kind of entertainment. I just want to listen.
Yeah, I mean, people, and I would say this is this is something that we're in the beginning stages of building this company that we take seriously, which is you can't just be objective. Like, people, you can't be C-SPAN, right? Like you have to keep people's attention, and you have to do it with integrity. And do I have the answer to that? Not yet. But I think like for us, it's like, how can we be interesting? How can we bring engaging voices to the table? How can we represent like a diversity, not just of opinion, but, gender, life experience, age. Like one thing I love about our show is that I'm like an older millennial, almost, I would say I'm culturally Gen X, even though I'm like in the end of the millennial train, but I grew up on alternative Seattle-based music and 90s hip hop and things like that. So I think I'm more culturally Gen X, and then we have a straight millennial, Corey, who's an African-American guy who grew up in the South. And then we've got a Gen Z libertarian Republican who's 22, I guess as she is. And so we have just way different life experiences in addition to our different political beliefs. And part of our recipe is to say, all right, like that should be interesting to somebody because, and we're also very different. Like Corey's got a kid, even though he's younger than me, he's got a son, and I'm like a single guy bachelor living in New York City. So in part, like and even though Ricky's 22, she's kind of like a grandma, who like lives in the library, So in weird ways, we break stereotype where I'm like the guy who probably his life resembles more a 22-year-old and hers probably resembles more a 40-year-old. And so like part of what that makes like for interesting conversations, because we'll debate things like the child tax credit, for example, and we'll have like a heated debate about like, I posited a theory. And for the fun of it, I kind of amped up my theory a little bit more. And I was honest with the audience eventually that this is what I was doing. But I amped up my theory more, and I was like against the child tax credit, which is not purely my position. But I kind of argued the single person's position and was like basically arguing that single people get screwed by our tax code. And like that was one of our most popular segments because it dovetailed with who we are personally, right? Is like, people want to like get to know you. They want to have a relationship with you. And if you're just didactic all the time, you're going to lose people. And so part of what we try to do is let people in on who we are as people as well. And so we're just new too. So like part of it is like over time, our sense is you listen to us for a year, you start to get the sense of, all right, this is who these people are. This is what's going on in their lives that informs the opinions that they have. And that's the fun part of it,
Yeah. Let's talk about education. Another one of my favorite subjects is I'm an educator, and obviously we have serious problems. You are the principal of a school. One of the episodes of the Lost Debate I listened to was about charter schools, right, in New Jersey, at the kind of the
Yes.
peak of the trough of your educational problems. So tell us a little bit about that. What is your position on charter schools and all the different models that are available out there for that?
Yeah, I would say like my baseline like feeling about the education debates that we have in our politics is that neither political party is offering a cogent explanation for how they're going to create a better experience for kids in our schools. But I would lay the sort of pathologies of the different parties in wildly different places. So I would say that the Republican Party is kind of in the starve the beast. We're going to, largely try to create quote unquote more efficient schools. They're obviously recently been obsessed with censorship within schools through this critical race theory debate. They used to be very pro measurement and of standardized testing and using data to drive instruction and stuff like that. And they've walked away from that. Like DeSantis has basically walked away from all standardized testing in Florida, for example. I wouldn't say they have a cogent theory anymore about what it means to be a great school. And that's a shame, because there were certain members of the right who I thought were onto something. Like Jeb Bush, for example, is somebody who I think when he was at his best had really important things to say about the education system. The Democrats, on the other hand, I think they generally gravitate towards either things that are easy to say, like we just want more funding. Like so much of the Democrats' proposals just equate to more funding. And it's almost like they're a hammer and everything's a nail. So they're for more funding in New York, where there's tons of funding. And then they're for more funding in places where I do think it's an important conversation, like Mississippi, where I ran schools, or Tennessee, where I ran schools. These are places where they need more funding, Arizona. Now, I think the Democrats' relationship with the teachers' unions is where I think they really go astray, which is when faced with a choice between making the experience better for kids and making it better for adults, they will always side with the adults. Now, I don't think that's always the choice that's presented, but I think San Francisco is a good example with that recent recall of the San Francisco board, is that the union fought to have those schools as closed as long as possible. Parents and kids were suffering, and the Democrats there, at least on that school board, sided with the unions because they know that Democratic primary politics make it really hard for somebody who's going to buck the union to succeed. And so what I would like to see more in our politics is people saying, how are we going to make more innovative, bold schools that help kids, and that help kids at every sort of level of society, whether you're the poorest, you're the worst off, to the people who are the best off? And also, how do we create more diverse, integrated schools so that people mix it up with people who are different from them? And that's, to me, where charter schools come in, is that in a perfect world, we wouldn't need charters. But one of the reasons why I like charters, and I'm not a maximalist when it comes to charters. Like, I think there are certain states that have really bad charter school laws, like Michigan's an example, Florida's an example, where they don't regulate them really well. But most places have some form of a law that says, all right, charter schools have to be nonprofit. They have to be authorized by a government body. In my case, in Nashville, we were authorized by the local school board. But in Mississippi, we were authorized by a board that the governor and the state legislature approved. And in both Tennessee and in Mississippi, and this is also true of New York and California, they're very stringent about who can get one of these things. And they're also, the trade-off is you get more freedom to design your own curriculum. You could do things like set your hours of your school day, pick your own curriculum, hire your own teachers, use innovative practices. But you're also, in exchange for that freedom, you have more accountability. So you could be shut down if you don't perform really well. And that's why I like charters, is like, in a lot of places, like I was 28 as a school principal, right? If I wanted to go through the traditional system and become a principal, I would have to kiss the ring for 30 years before I became a school principal in New York City. And even then, the reward would be being able to call myself the leader of a building, but I couldn't hire and fire my own people. I can't pick my own curriculum. I can't set my own hours. I can't even, there's rules about how much feedback you can give to teachers, which usually equates to not a lot. And so you're not really the leader of the building, right? So why is that the apex of the job? And also there's this sort of question of like keeping young, innovative, engaging teachers in the work. Like if you're the LeBron James of teaching, you don't get compensated and rewarded accordingly. The only thing that generally matters in most school systems in terms of setting your pay is how many years you've existed as a teacher, not how good you are, not what kind of results you're bringing for kids and all that. And so that's one of the reasons why I like charters, but also I like them because most places, they don't have a neighborhood zone. So you can go to a charter from anywhere within the zone of the entire city that you exist in. And what that means is they can be used as a tool for integration. Now, they're not always used that way, but they can be used as a tool for integration. That's one of the reasons why I like them. Now, I'm not like, I don't believe that charters are the only answer. I think they're a very small part of a larger picture of how I would want to innovate within our school system. But I just want more out of our parties. I want our schools to be better.
To clarify, Ravi, the charter schools get public money, not private money, right? So they're not run by a corporation or whatever. So that's why you have to be tied to the state government.
Yeah, there are some states that allow for-profit charter schools, but they're the minority. Like, so Florida allows them. I think Arizona allows them. I think Michigan allows them. And they also have very loose standards for who gets a charter in those states. Whereas in places like California, New York, et cetera, you're a nonprofit. You are allowed to accept, just as public schools are, like you're allowed to accept donations into a foundation to help supplement that funding. But by and large, charters either run on fewer per pupil dollars, which was our case in Tennessee and Mississippi, even after the philanthropy, because there are certain things we don't get. Like, we don't get a free facility, for example. We don't get free busing, for example. And so once you factor those things in, even after the philanthropy, you're running on less dollars. But I think that's a small part of the conversation, though.
And for the charter schools, the parents can pick wherever they want to send their kid. They don't have to be in the zip code like with normal public schools, right?
Yeah, you have to be just within whatever the boundary of the city or district is that you're in. And so, like, we would pull kids from all over Nashville, for example, to go to our schools. And that's one thing, like, if I were to reform the system, is, so much of the, people, my progressive friends say they're against quote unquote school choice. And what they mean by that is charters and vouchers, which we can talk about. But they don't call school choice moving to the right neighborhood so that they could go to the right school and buy the fancy house that has the right public school down the street that walls off people who have less income from them. They don't call that school choice. They're not against that and actually celebrate that. They say the neighborhood school is like this thing that we should praise, and we need to protect the neighborhood school as if everybody lives in like this kind of Pleasantville. Whereas the neighborhood school is actually a tool of exclusion. When you draw that boundary around your school district, you're telling people in lower income neighborhoods they can't go to their school, but they don't call that school choice. They don't call sending your kid to a private school choice, or the fact that our tax code allows essentially private clubs, which is what private schools are, to exist. Like, why we give tax exempt status to private schools is a whole other conversation. A lot of private schools who are not doing anything to push equity. And so the public good that they're serving is really up for debate, in my opinion.
So if I understand this correctly, we're getting an educational inequality because of the Matthew effect. To those who have, more shall be given. So the slightly better neighborhood that has more expensive homes, so they have higher property tax, and that money goes to the education. That school gets a little bit better, and then the neighborhood in the opposite direction goes the other way. And after decades, half a century or so, you have these just massively different school districts, and parents are just making choices for their own family. They're not trying to exclude anybody. They just want what's best for their kid. So the system itself is rigged in a way.
Yes. Yeah, and I totally understand parents who make these choices. I would want a few things from them. One is, I wouldn't want them to deny opportunity to people who are not like them. So, like, don't stand in the way of things like charter schools or even vouchers when they exist. And there's a whole different debate about how to make vouchers work well. But, like, I wouldn't want to deny that choice to somebody else. Like, if you're exercising that choice, like, my rule number one is don't be a hypocrite about it. Number two is find opportunities to trade your privilege in ways that you still can ensure that your kid is well off, but where you can open up opportunities to others. So, like, how do you, like, allow, if you live down the street from an excellent school, and maybe accepting more students and increasing the capacity of that school makes your education for your kid maybe a little less possibly, reliably excellent. But what it means is other people can access that opportunity, then, work to make that happen. Or to build more affordable housing in your neighborhood, which in that sense is any density, right? Like, a lot of this, you might have listened to some of these episodes. We've been talking a lot about in the Lost Debate, like how progressives are often standing in the way of increased housing density. It's like another way to offer the opportunity for more families in your neighborhood is to build more housing in your neighborhood, which a lot of people are usually against, right? So that's what I would ask of people is, like, find ways to trade your privilege for just the opportunity for people to be a little bit better off, for more people to access the kind of privilege that you have, and certainly don't stand in the way of other people when they're trying to come up with solutions.
All right, let's run the libertarian experiment. That'll never happen, but just how you as a Democrat would respond to this. All right, get rid of all government schools. No more public education, just private schools. Look what private industry is able to do with the cost of computing power, computers, cell phones, and the price goes down. So this is what happens when markets run it and the government just mucks it up. So just get rid of them. Okay, this is never going to happen, of course. But what's the argument against that?
Well, okay, there are 3 stages to this, right? You have all government-controlled district-run schools, which is most districts in America in some way. You could say 100% charter, which is what New Orleans did, right? Which is, instead of saying, all right, there's all privately run schools, it's all nonprofits who are receiving money from the government, but they're not run directly by the government. And people could look this up. New Orleans saw dramatically positive results from that experiment. And whether it's graduation rates, whether it's academic achievement, student well-being, Tulane has been studying this. And it is indisputably true that experiment worked really well for the city of New Orleans. Now, there are all sorts of issues that had to be worked out. And I could have a whole separate conversation about that. I probably will on my podcast about just like what happened in New Orleans. But that was unambiguously good for more students than it was bad. Now, what has not been tried yet is the third option, which is all private schools, and maybe everybody gets money, right? Like, let's say every kid gets a $10,000 check, right? Let's say if you're using the Tennessee kids get about $10,000 per student for education. And we just give everybody a $10,000 check, and then we say, all right, go. Now, I suspect that you would have 5 to 10 years of relative pain. And this is why a lot of people won't do it, and why I understand why they wouldn't do it, is because a lot of kids would suffer because there wouldn't be adequate supply, right? Like there just won't be enough schools, and a lot of bad schools will happen. A lot of like charlatans will exist, et cetera. So I just wouldn't want to unleash the beast. I would want a gradual. And by the way, that's not my dream is 100%, but let's pretend like we want to get to that point just to see what it would look like. I would have a phased in approach where I would do like 25% at a time or something, because you need to ensure adequate supply. Because if you don't have that supply, then kids just will have nowhere to go.
Right. So the fear is that there'll be poor kids falling through the cracks. Of course, poor kids are falling through the cracks already with the public education system, right?
Yes. Absolutely.
Aren't graduation,
like that's the thing is like if you're a kid growing up, and this is true in rural areas, if you're a white kid, or in urban areas, if you're low income and Black or Latino, there are a lot of places where it's hard to imagine a worse situation, and like the district school that was run down the street from the very first school I started had less than 1% of kids graduating with a college-ready ACT. Less than 1%. And when you go visit that school, it's chaos in the school. And so, like, from that perspective, if you're a parent and you're going to want to experiment, because you're like, almost anything's better than this. And I think that's the challenge of people who have privilege. They can't imagine how bad things are for other people. So when they hear radical change, they're like, how like every election is change versus more of the same. Progressives are actually small c conservative on this stuff. They don't want any change because the way things work for them is it's working. Like, so they don't want any radical change. Whereas I think the base of the Democratic Party, by and large, looks around and is like, whoa, like it's why Black and brown families are way more supportive of charter schools than white progressives are. It's because they know that the traditional system, it by and large, is so flawed that they're willing to consider almost anything else and see if it works. And the thing is, we've been running the experiment of charters for 10 to 20 years in a lot of urban settings, and people like them. And in a lot of cities, like New York, like Nashville, Miami, go down the list, where you have a pretty decent sized charter sector, they're super popular with those families, And so that to me, like, tells me a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea of a big, huge brick and mortar building that thousands of kids go to, public high schools, say, middle schools, grammar schools. Okay, that was my trajectory too. It's just so used to it. But it's really not that old, right? It's maybe just not even a century old. Really, where did people get their education before? And if we transport ourselves, let's say a century from now, what do we need brick and mortar buildings for? I mean, the availability of fantastic online content now already and getting better all the time. And now you're adding your own media company and all this stuff. And okay, why do we need to ship kids off to this? So that I noticed, I think you guys were talking about the homeschooling movement growing, not just, religious fundamentalists and creationists, doing homeschooling, but now lots of secular parents as well. Anyway, what's the future of education that as you look at the big picture?
Yeah, well, you point out like the common school, as we called it, is a relatively new creation, like largely like the turn of the century. Now, things before that were not great. A lot of people just didn't have any education. If you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're poor, you just didn't have an option. So that was bad. Now, what do we see in the future? There's going to be, like all things in society, a disaggregation of schools. We just talked about it for media, right? Like the big institutions are less influential than they used to be, and you have this rise of small, nimble players. And like what it means to be media is different, right? Like if you have a microphone and a YouTube account, you could be media, right? And I think this is true of schooling, right? Like the idea of like the idea that you need that super expensive building with all the rules and regulations around it and all that is going to be challenged. It certainly has been challenged in COVID. Now, a good example is what happened in San Francisco, where they kept the schools closed as long as they did, is that parents organized to create learning hubs in their neighborhoods. Now, side note, the school board fought that, didn't support it, but that's a whole other conversation. Now, what you learn is through these learning hubs, this is where I would be spending my time thinking, is about how do you create either micro schools, learning hubs, where you could take advantage of really strong online curriculum and you can give people more localized, nimble ways to get kids together in person, because that's still good. The socializing is important. Sports, arts, creativity, playing. Even though I'm like a stickler for skills, like I still believe all those other things are super important. But I actually think you could create really well-run community versions of these schools that can coexist alongside a traditional system if people still want that. And you could say, all right, like my kid is just going to be killing it on Khan Academy for 5 hours a day. And then they're going to be surfing for 3 hours a day, or they're going to be playing basketball for 3 hours a day, or they want to paint for 3 hours a day, right? Like that should be an option for kids. Now it's going to be messy to get there. And I think people's tolerance for mistakes and all this kind of stuff is high. And it's kind of like creating a self-driven car, right? Like people don't compare they're not comparing the death rates of self-driven cars against the death rates of traditional cars, right? They're comparing it to they have zero tolerance for risk, right? So like the minute one person dies from a self-driven car, it's going to be like shutdown mode, right? Versus like people die every day from texting and driving and drinking and driving, or just honest to goodness mistakes, right? So I think this is what's going to happen in schools, is they're not going to be comparing those learning hubs to the disaster of a district school down the street from some of these people. They're just going to be comparing it purely to say, oh, did somebody steal money? Did some kid get molested from a poorly trained staff member or vetted staff member in a learning hub or whatever? And people are going to learn. They're going to get better. There are certain things you could do on the outset to make these things maximize the chances that they can succeed from the outset. But there will be trial and error. But I do think in the end you'll come out with a better system than we have right now if we see that kind of innovation.
Yeah, I was at the TED conference when the Khan Academy guy gave his I Have a Dream speech about future of education through these Khan Academy videos and related technologies. And afterwards, like 5 minutes after, outside in the hallway, I saw Bill Gates pull him aside and went, oh, okay. And then the next thing I know, he's got funding from the Gates Foundation. It's like, holy crap. So this is how it happens, right? I mean, and then I noticed he did produce quite a few, but I stopped following it. Maybe it plateaued, or I don't know what kind of influence the Khan Academy has, or related tech companies producing that kind of content.
Yeah, Khan is alive and well. And if you go on there, you can do anything from study the MCAT to teach yourself to do basic addition to quantum physics. It's really incredible. It had explanations for COVID and what COVID was. I looked that up. Like there was, recently there was a breakthrough in nuclear fusion, and I looked up fusion on Khan Academy. So even as an adult, I look at it. But also when I was, 10 years ago when I was running schools, I was using it. And I would, there's always this question of differentiation in schools, right? There's the lesson going on, but inevitably there are outliers on the bottom, kids who aren't getting the lesson and they need remediation. And then there's outliers on the top, the kids who just learn so quickly they get bored. Now, what you could do is you can have, let's say you have 2 classes of 25 kids each. The old method is to have 2 classes of 25 next door to each other, where there's one teacher and everybody's getting the same lesson. Now, what you could do is you can have one class of 40 kids and then have the other, and they all get the same lesson. And in the back of the classroom, the second teacher is pulling 10 kids to the back of the room, or it could be 20, whatever, depending on how well it's run, where maybe half of those kids are the high flyers. They're working on Khan Academy. And they're ahead. And you could play with these numbers. And then there's 5 kids who really need like super intensive remediation, and they get that. And then like, and if you've ever learned anything, you know this, like 5 to 10 minutes with an expert is better than an hour of just hearing droning lessons on and on. So you could pull a group of 5 kids to the back of the room for 5 minutes, send them back. Another 5 kids, work on them intensely, send them back into the front of the class. And that's what a classroom, in my opinion, like that's a better version of a classroom than just 25 kids listening to the same lesson, right? And that's what Khan Academy allows. Like you could pull the 5, 10, 15 kids to do the advanced lesson. You could also do it in the remediation. You could have identified through data, which is why I'm a believer in data to drive instruction, from like a short exit quiz the day before, that the reason why somebody's doing long division wrong or something is they're not lining things up correctly or whatever, or they have a basic arithmetic issue. And you could identify that, fix that for the student. But if you identify that issue and you have 25 kids in your classroom and it's only you with those 25 kids, you may even know that that's an issue with your kid, but you don't have the tools to fix it if you don't have the online tools or you don't have the differentiation and the innovation of pulling those schools together. But this gets back to my question of what the Democrats have wrong. Under most union rules, you can't do what I just described. And that's a problem, or in many places. I don't want to exaggerate, but in a lot of places, what I just described is against union contract. And to me, that's a problem. Like that's standing in the way of good.
Is that because their mission statement is to protect the jobs of teachers, and everything you just described could threaten the jobs of teachers, something like that?
That's why the teachers union, in my opinion, I'm not in their soul, but I suspect it's why the teachers union opposed the learning hubs in San Francisco, is because non-union people were teaching kids. Now, I'm a big believer that great teachers change lives. They changed my lives. And honestly, if I could pay great teachers $1 million a year, like they do in Korea, like for one reason or another, and it might be exaggeration of the amount of money, like because of the way that they scale great learning, like a great lecturer on a given subject in Korea is like a superstar, right? Like if I could pay great teachers a lot, or even just the normal teacher who sticks with it more than they do now, I would do that. But I would also open up the profession to more people. I would also like create other roles, like this person who's running a learning hub. They might not be technically a teacher, but they're really good at maybe getting a kid to like sit still on that Khan Academy, and they're really good at like looking at the data in Khan Academy to like keep a kid on track. Or they might be just a good presence and a mentor for kids, so that when they go there and they're working on their computer, they could take a break and talk to that person about what's going on in their lives. Or they might just be good at organizing a good basketball game, and like maybe that's a job, and so I would open it up to more types of different roles as well. But there's like many reasons why the teachers union opposes this kind of stuff. Part of it is just it's just detritus that adds up over time. It's like one rule leads to another rule, and then at a certain point, like in New York, you have 100+ page. I don't even know what it could be, over 200 pages now. I don't even know 100+ page contract that governs every little thing in the life of a school and makes it nearly impossible to run the school. And that to me is bad for kids, bad for student unions, teachers,
Yeah, why aren't there student unions that stand up against the teachers' unions? Yeah. we stand for the students and what you're doing is not helping them. And you push back.
Yeah, I'm sure these things exist. The thing is, in many ways, parents are a good stand-in for their kids, and there are people who've organized things like parents' unions out there. And I think, for better or worse, and I think it's in many ways for worse, it's kind of what's going on with the CRT debates, the critical race theory debates, is these parents are fighting back. Now, I'm not necessarily excited particularly about what they're fighting back in service of, but they're going after schools, and and they're quote unquote trying to hold their schools accountable. Now, I don't think banning Beloved is like a good use of their time, but Democrats have been flat-footed on this, and that's why you see people like Terry McAuliffe making tone-deaf statements about parents not having a voice in their kids' education. It's because they've been trained to talk like that. They know that they've been trained that over time they're able to beat back pressure from parents because they know that the union is going to be with them 5 elections from now, whereas they count on parents losing their energy and not being organized. And so this critical race theory thing is like an interesting test case of what happens if parents are organized. Now, I don't love it because I don't love some of the solutions being posited. Like, I think like the idea that a deep and honest reading of our nation's history needs to be weeded out of our schools is problematic. Like, I do think there are certain things in the curriculum that they're critiquing that are valid critiques, but I think the solutions go way too far. And I think that the motivations, the national coordination and the motivations around it are bad. And also, like, I'm a libertarian. I think censoring any books is generally bad. Like, I would have, if I could design a library, anything would be in there, honestly. If a kid wants to learn, short of how to design a nuclear weapon or something, I would allow anything in that library,
Yeah, I've been kind of conflicted about the CRT debate. I at first like the work of Chris Rufo, who's posting all these insane documents that were being spread to employees in major corporations and in schools by teachers and principals. And it's like, holy moly, what are they teaching again now? And how old are these kids? 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old. I mean, I learned about slavery in high school, I guess. Seems age appropriate, whatever. Mm-hmm. So I was glad to see him doing that. And then all of a sudden he made this shift toward, we're turning to the government to step in and start banning ideas that can be taught. And it's like, wait a minute, you're a conservative. You're on Fox News all the time. And conservatives believe in, small government and non-censorship and free speech and First Amendment and we don't want the government telling us what we can read. And all of a sudden he's posting on Twitter, because I follow him, here's a list of the banned ideas that the government is going to step in and say, you cannot teach these. And I'm like, wait a minute. How is that a conservative value?
Yeah, and it's not. And that's my thing, is like, I separate a fair reading from our history from some of the other stuff. So for me, like, teaching a kid about slavery, even in elementary school, it's important. Like, and I remember reading books like, Jump Ship to Freedom. I read in the 5th grade or 4th grade, as a book about slavery.
Ooh,
like,
wow.
And it was like, that to me was like important. Now, we could debate whether it's 5th grade, it's 1st grade or whatever. But what I'm curious is, what are you afraid of? Like, some of these conservatives on that question. Now, we'll get to the stuff that I agree with you is too much, but like that kind of stuff, like that makes me very suspicious, especially when I know what some other policies these people are pushing. Now, even when I was running schools, there were this movement of people who were trying to push curriculum that made kids focus on their immutable characteristics and own their privilege and all this kind of stuff that I think is highly suspect. And it's not that I don't want kids to be aware of their privilege. It's the way they're going about it is being reductionist to say, all right, if you're white, you're this. If you're black, you're that. And then you train kids to see each other as those things, as opposed to overcoming those. Like, we want the next generation. I don't ever think we're going to ever have a colorblind society, but you want the next generation to be able to empathize with each other and learn from each other and break down barriers, not erect new barriers to understanding each other. And I think a lot of time this curriculum would do that. And I also think that the same movement is commingled with the weakening of things like high standards for academic achievement and emphasis on core knowledge and skills. And there's Rufo and others have pointed out certain curriculum and trainings for adults that equate things like reading, writing, punctuality, like certain reading of history, et cetera, as white supremacy. Like the idea that like math is white supremacist or writing is white supremacist. And to me, that's silly. And I think it's a misreading. It's like, yeah, a white person came up with, the theory of gravity. That doesn't mean that gravity is racist, right? Like, this is where I'm just like this is crazy. It's crazy talk. And as a non-white person, I feel like I have a little bit of leeway, and we talk about it on the show. We have a diverse team, like at Lost Debate. And one thing I really love about our team is that we're a group of people that are diverse, but we call out things like affinity groups and some of the more extreme versions of the CRT stuff and all that, but also draw a line. We're not conservative media in the sense that we're not like, and therefore let's ban the books. And there's a Florida law that they're pushing to say, like, if a lesson makes a student feel discomfort because of their race, then it needs to be banned. And I'm like, well, that's a bad law. If I teach you about slavery and that makes you feel bad as a white person, I don't want you to feel bad, but like that could happen. And it's totally subjective. Like, it's all in your head, what's discomfort or not, right? I wouldn't want to have a lesson be you're white, therefore feel bad. But it's just like these laws are so sloppy and overreaching that they're comically bad. And that's why I oppose a lot of them. It still means a lot of times you can self-regulate. Like, let's have a conversation about good and bad curriculum and have schools make better choices as opposed to banning things,
Yeah. All right, Ravi, we've been going an hour and a half here. Let me just give you one final big picture question here. Let's say the Biden administration or the Bill Gates Foundation calls you up and says, we want to give your media company $1 billion. Go out and make a difference. Protect us from this problem or that problem, or solve this problem of polarization or whatever. What would you do?
Yeah, I would do a few things, but one in particular is I would go out and create a localized version of what we're doing at Lost Debate, where in community after community, I love local news, and I think local news is dying. I would do, among other things, I would find the 2 or 3 people in a community who should be having a regular conversation multiple times a week about subjects, and build a culture and a way of just going about those conversations locally, where people are having good faith, open and honest conversations, where they're striving to find areas of agreement, push on areas of disagreement, tolerate a diversity of viewpoints. And I would see those in every community across America. I would also I would seed a team of creative, exciting people to create content in things like Twitter and YouTube and all that, to say, like, people who are more entertaining than I am and funnier than I am, to say, how do we take this objectivity and make it exciting, make it, have it compete with the cat videos and the dancing videos and all these other things that are on the internet, compete with compete with people who are like the sensational, like, argumentative negativity within the media. I would see like way more, and a lot of the stuff we're doing, but just we're going to be doing on a smaller scale than what $1 billion would afford us to do. But I would be just pushing out way more entertaining content that battles against the sort of dopamine hit media that people are getting right now. And those are just 2 things, but among other things. But that's where I'd start.
Yes. Well, if I had $1 billion, I'd give it to you, but I don't. So
yeah, well,
hopefully somebody else will do that.
If you listen, throw it my way. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. After you make a donation to the Skeptic Society, be sure and support the Lost Debate. That's right.
Yes, they can go to our
right,
webpage,
Ravi, thank you so much.
And get,
yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah, tell us where people can look up your media company and all your projects.
Yes, they can follow me on various internet platforms at Ravi M. Gupta, but more importantly, they can follow Lost Debate at Lost Debate on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, but also lostdebate.com is our website. And if you just look up Lost Debate on YouTube, you can watch our show.
Good.
Oh, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Oh, yeah. Most importantly, if you're a podcast listener, anywhere you get your podcast, if you search Lost Debate, you could subscribe.
Perfect. All right, Ravi, thank you so much. Thank you for your work. And I would say good luck, because I think the pendulum is not swinging back yet the other way. So we got our work cut out for us, whatever that pendulum is.